Reeking point came during what should have been a routine White House press briefing, but Joe Rogan was watching from his Austin studio with the kind of horrified fascination that people reserve for natural disasters and political catastrophes. Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt stood at the podium with her perfectly styled blonde hair and practiced smile, deflecting serious questions about foreign policy, with the kind of aggressive spin that would have made North Korean state media proud. The president's position on the Ukraine situation has been consistently clear and brilliantly strategic, Leavitt was saying, her voice carrying the mechanical precision of someone who had been thoroughly programmed to deliver talking points regardless of their relationship to reality. Any suggestion that his policies have been ineffective is simply fake news from journalists who hate America and want to see our great nation fail. Rogan paused his live podcast recording and turned to his producer, Jamie Vernon, with an expression of disgusted disbelief. Are we really supposed to pretend that this woman was chosen for this job based on her qualifications rather than the fact that she looks like she stepped out of a Trump Tower commercial? For months, Rogan had been watching Leavitt's press briefings with growing alarm, not because of any particular political disagreement, but because her performance represented something far more disturbing than simple partisan spin. She wasn't just defending Trump's policies, she was systematically attacking the very concept of independent journalism, while presenting herself as the sole source of truth in American politics. Look at how she handles these questions, Rogan continued, rewinding the footage to show Leavitt's response to a question about economic statistics. She doesn't engage with the substance of what the reporters are asking. She immediately attacks them personally, accuses them of being fake news, and then delivers these completely fabricated talking points that sound like they were written by someone who's never read a newspaper. The footage showed Leavitt responding to a straightforward question about unemployment figures by launching into a 2-minute attack on the reporter's previous work, accusing her of being biased against Trump, and then providing economic statistics that were demonstrably false, but delivered with such confidence that they sounded authoritative to anyone who wasn't paying close attention. This isn't just incompetence, Rogan realized as he studied her technique. This is a deliberate strategy to normalize lying as a form of communication. She's not trying to inform the public, she's trying to train them to accept propaganda as news. But it was the research that his team had been conducting into Leavitt's background that revealed the true scope of what they were dealing with. Far from being a qualified communications professional who had earned her position through experience and expertise, Leavitt appeared to have been selected primarily for her willingness to deliver any message, no matter how false, with the kind of attractive authority that would make it palatable to television audiences. "Joe, you need to see this," Vernon said, pulling up a series of documents that painted a disturbing picture of how Leavitt had been recruited and trained for her current role. This woman doesn't have any significant experience in government communications, policy analysis, or journalism. Her entire career has been built around looking good on television while saying whatever her bosses wanted her to say. The documents revealed that Leavitt had been identified by Trump's political operatives, not because of her communication skills, but because of her appearance, her willingness to attack critics aggressively, and her complete lack of independent expertise that might interfere with message discipline. She had essentially been hired to serve as an attractive face for authoritarian communication tactics. "Look at her training materials," Vernon continued, showing Rogan a series of internal documents that had been leaked by White House staff members who were disgusted by what they had witnessed. She's been specifically coached to never acknowledge factual errors, to always attack questioners rather than answering questions, and to present obviously false information with absolute confidence. The training documents revealed a systematic effort to transform White House communications from a function that served the public interest into a propaganda operation that served only Trump's personal and political interests. Leavitt hadn't been chosen despite her lack of qualifications, she had been chosen because of it. They don't want someone who knows enough about policy to accidentally tell the truth, Rogan observed as he studied the materials. They want someone who will say anything they tell her to say, and who will do it with enough confidence and attractiveness to make people believe it's true. But it was the recordings of Leavitt's private communications that truly revealed the cynical nature of her role and her complete awareness of the deception she was perpetrating on the American public. I know the unemployment numbers I cited yesterday were completely wrong. Leavitt's voice was clearly audible on a recording that had apparently been made during a staff meeting. But the point isn't accuracy. The point is creating a narrative that supports the president's re-election campaign. If reporters want to fact-check me, that just proves they're biased against us. The recordings continued with detailed discussions of how to manipulate media coverage, suppress unfavorable stories, and present false information in ways that would be difficult for journalists to challenge effectively in real time. The beauty of the current system is that we control the pace of information, Leavitt explained to her staff. By the time reporters can fact-check what I said in today's briefing, we'll already be pushing tomorrow's narrative. And if they try to hold me accountable for previous false statements, I just attack them for living in the past instead of focusing on current issues. As Rogan listened to recording after recording of Leavitt openly discussing her role in deceiving the American public, he realized that he wasn't just dealing with an incompetent press secretary. He was looking at evidence of a systematic propaganda campaign that was using an attractive spokesperson to normalize authoritarian communication tactics in American democracy. The question now was whether he could expose this deception in a way that would force the American people to confront what was being done to their democracy in the name of political loyalty. Joe Rogan's decision to dedicate an entire podcast episode to exposing Karoline Leavitt's propaganda operation came after weeks of internal debate about whether attacking a specific government official crossed the line from commentary into activism. But the evidence his team had gathered was so comprehensive and disturbing that he felt a moral obligation to share it with his massive audience. I want to be clear about something before we start, Rogan said as he began what would become one of the most controversial episodes in his show's history. This isn't about Republican versus Democrat or Trump versus his critics. This is about something much more fundamental. It's about whether we're going to allow our government to systematically lie to us using techniques that would make North Korean propagandists proud. He began by playing clips of Leavitt's most egregious performances, contrasting her confident delivery of false information with the actual facts that could be easily verified by anyone with internet access. The contrast was stark and deeply disturbing. A government official who seemed to view truth as an obstacle to be overcome rather than a foundation for democratic governance. Look at this response to a question about climate science, Rogan said, playing footage of Leavitt dismissing established scientific consensus with the kind of authoritative confidence that made her false statements sound credible. She's not engaging with the actual science, she's attacking the scientists, attacking the reporters who asked the question, and then presenting completely fabricated information as if it were established fact. But it was his analysis of Leavitt's systematic attacks on journalism that revealed the true scope of the propaganda operation she was conducting. Every single day, this woman stands at that podium and attacks the free press as enemies of the American people, Rogan continued, showing compilation footage of Leavitt's aggressive confrontations with reporters. But watch how she does it. She never addresses the substance of their questions. She immediately goes personal, attacks their credibility, and then presents herself as the only trustworthy source of information. The pattern was unmistakable once it was properly analyzed. Leavitt wasn't just defending Trump's policies, she was systematically undermining public trust in any source of information that wasn't controlled by the Trump administration. This is straight out of the authoritarian playbook, Rogan explained to his audience. Step 1. Discredit independent sources of information. Step 2. Present government propaganda as the only reliable truth. Step 3. Attack anyone who questions the official narrative as traitors or foreign agents. But it was the revelation of Leavitt's personal awareness of her deceptive role that truly shocked Rogan's audience and provided undeniable evidence of intentional propaganda. I want you to listen to this recording of Karoline Leavitt talking to her staff about how to handle questions she can't answer honestly, Rogan said before playing audio that had been leaked by disgusted White House employees. Leavitt's voice was clear and unmistakable. Remember, the goal is never to provide accurate information. The goal is to control the narrative and make questioners look biased or unreasonable. If a reporter asks about something that makes the president look bad, don't engage with the facts, attack the reporter's motives, and redirect to talking points that make us look good. The recording continued with Leavitt providing specific coaching to her staff about how to manipulate media coverage while maintaining the appearance of legitimate government communication. When I attack reporters for asking legitimate questions, I'm not being defensive. I'm being strategic, she explained. Every time I make them look biased or hostile, I'm reinforcing our narrative that the mainstream media is fake news and that we're the only source of truth. Rogan paused the recording and addressed his audience directly. Do you understand what you just heard? This woman is openly admitting that her job is to lie to the American people while attacking anyone who tries to hold her accountable for those lies. But the most damaging evidence came from Leavitt's private communications with Trump himself, which revealed that her propaganda techniques were being directly coordinated with the president's political strategy. The boss wants me to be more aggressive in tomorrow's briefing. Leavitt's voice was audible on another leaked recording. He specifically wants me to attack the reporter who asked about the Justice Department investigation. He doesn't care if my attacks are factually accurate. He just wants me to make her look like she's working for our enemies. The response from Trump was equally revealing. That's exactly right, Karoline. These people aren't journalists. They're political operatives who are trying to destroy our movement. Hit them hard, make them look bad, and never apologize for defending America. As Rogan played recording after recording of similar conversations, a clear picture emerged of a systematic effort to transform government communication from a public service into a weapon for attacking democratic institutions. This isn't just about one incompetent press secretary, Rogan explained to his audience. This is about a coordinated campaign to normalize authoritarian communication tactics in American politics. They're training the public to accept lies as truth and to view independent journalism as treason. The response to Rogan's exposé was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours of the podcast release, social media platforms were flooded with clips from his presentation and discussions of the evidence he had revealed. Major news networks, initially hesitant to amplify criticism from a podcast host, were forced to respond as the story dominated online conversations, and congressional Democrats began demanding investigations. But it was the response from White House staff members that provided the most compelling validation of Rogan's allegations. Within 24 hours of his broadcast, 3 current and former White House communications employees had come forward publicly to confirm that everything he had revealed was accurate and to provide additional evidence of the propaganda operation. Joe Rogan told the truth about what we've been watching happen inside this administration, former White House Communications Director Sarah Matthews said during a televised interview. Karoline Leavitt wasn't chosen for her qualifications. She was chosen because she was willing to lie convincingly and attack anyone who questioned those lies. The confirmation from inside sources transformed Rogan's podcast from controversial commentary into a credible exposé of government propaganda, forcing even mainstream media outlets to acknowledge the systematic nature of the deception that had been taking place. But it was Leavitt's own response that ultimately proved everything Rogan had said about her propaganda techniques. Karoline Leavitt's response to Joe Rogan's exposé followed exactly the playbook that he had described, providing real-time confirmation of his allegations about her propaganda techniques while simultaneously demonstrating her complete inability to engage with legitimate criticism in any substantive way. Joe Rogan has become another voice in the fake news media ecosystem that is desperate to attack this administration because they can't stand the success President Trump is delivering for the American people, Leavitt announced during what was supposed to be a routine press briefing, but quickly devolved into a personal attack on one of America's most popular media personalities. The performance was exactly what Rogan had predicted: no engagement with the substance of his allegations, immediate personal attacks on his credibility, and a reflexive retreat into Trump-supporting talking points that had no relationship to the issues being raised. Instead of addressing the evidence that Joe Rogan presented, she's doing exactly what he said she would do, observed CNN's Jim Acosta during live coverage of the press briefing. She's attacking the messenger while ignoring the message, which is itself proof that his analysis was accurate. But it was Leavitt's systematic escalation of attacks against Rogan that revealed the desperation behind her propaganda operation and the lengths to which she would go to avoid accountability for her deception. Joe Rogan spreads conspiracy theories and misinformation to millions of Americans, while hiding behind the pretense of being an independent voice. Leavitt continued during her briefing, reading from what appeared to be prepared talking points. His attack on me is really an attack on President Trump and the American people who support our agenda of making America great again. The deflection was masterful in its cynicism. She was transforming legitimate criticism of her professional conduct into evidence of broader political bias, using the same technique that Rogan had identified as central to her propaganda methodology. But it was her appearance on friendly media outlets that truly revealed the extent of her self-awareness and her complete commitment to deception as a communication strategy. The establishment media and their allies like Joe Rogan can't stand the fact that we have a press secretary who fights back against their lies and defends the truth, Leavitt said during an interview on a conservative network that was clearly designed to provide her with a sympathetic platform. The irony was staggering. She was accusing Rogan of lying while simultaneously providing no evidence to refute any of his specific allegations, instead relying on the kind of circular reasoning that characterized authoritarian propaganda worldwide. When Joe Rogan says I was chosen for my appearance rather than my qualifications, he's showing the kind of sexist bias that the fake news media always uses to attack strong conservative women, Leavitt continued, attempting to transform professional criticism into gender-based discrimination. But it was her invocation of national security concerns that truly revealed how completely she had internalized authoritarian communication tactics. Rogan's attacks on me serve the interests of America's enemies who want to see our government weakened and divided, she said, using the classic authoritarian technique of labeling domestic criticism as foreign manipulation. When he undermines confidence in official government communications, he's helping China and Russia spread disinformation that damages American democracy. The argument was so audacious that even her supporters began expressing private concerns about her mental stability and professional judgment. She was essentially arguing that criticism of government propaganda was itself a form of treason, a position that would have been familiar to officials in North Korea, China, or any other authoritarian system. But the most revealing moment came when she was directly confronted by a reporter about the specific recordings that Rogan had played on his podcast. Ma'am, Joe Rogan played audio recordings of you explicitly stating that your job is to control narratives rather than provide accurate information. How do you respond to those specific allegations? Asked a reporter from the Associated Press. Leavitt's response provided perfect confirmation of everything Rogan had said about her propaganda techniques. Those recordings are either fabricated or taken completely out of context by enemies of this administration who want to destroy President Trump. I will not dignify fake evidence with a substantive response, and I think the American people can see through these obvious attempts to undermine their democratically elected government. She had simultaneously refused to address the evidence while attacking the questioner and presenting herself as a victim of political persecution, exactly the pattern that Rogan had identified as her standard operating procedure. But it was the analysis from former government communications professionals that provided the most damaging assessment of Leavitt's performance and its implications for American democracy. What we're seeing from Karoline Leavitt is unprecedented in American political history, explained Jennifer Palmieri, who had served as White House Communications Director under Barack Obama. Previous press secretaries, regardless of party, understood that their job was to provide information to the public and explain government policy. Leavitt has transformed the role into pure propaganda, where the goal is to attack critics and present false information as truth. The bipartisan nature of the criticism was particularly damaging to Leavitt's position, as former Republican communications officials joined their Democratic counterparts in expressing alarm about her propaganda techniques. "I've worked for Republican presidents and conservative organizations for 30 years, and I've never seen anything like what Karoline Leavitt is doing," said former Bush administration press secretary Ari Fleischer. "Her job is supposed to be serving the public interest by providing accurate information about government activities. Instead, she's conducting political warfare against anyone who questions the administration's narrative." As the week progressed, the pressure on Leavitt intensified through channels that revealed the growing isolation of her propaganda operation within the broader political and media establishment. Even conservative commentators who normally supported Trump began expressing concerns about her techniques and their implications for the credibility of government communications. "Karoline Leavitt is making it impossible for anyone to trust anything that comes from this administration," observed Fox News host Tucker Carlson during a broadcast that was clearly damaging to the White House's media strategy. When a press secretary's first instinct is always to attack and never to inform, she stops being a government official and becomes a political operative. But it was the response from congressional Republicans that truly revealed the scope of the problem that Leavitt's propaganda operation was creating for Trump's political coalition. The White House press secretary's job is to communicate with the American people about government activities, not to conduct political warfare against journalists and media personalities, said Senator Susan Collins during a press conference that was clearly coordinated with other moderate Republicans. Miss Leavitt's confrontational approach is making it difficult for even supportive members of Congress to defend the administration's communication strategy. As the criticism mounted from across the political spectrum, it became clear that Leavitt's propaganda techniques were becoming a liability rather than an asset for the Trump administration, alienating potential allies while providing ammunition for critics who wanted to characterize the government as fundamentally dishonest and authoritarian. The question now was whether the administration would recognize that her North Korean-style loyalty and aggressive propaganda were damaging rather than helping their political objectives, or whether they would double down on authoritarian communication tactics, regardless of the political costs. The tipping point came not through traditional political channels or mainstream media coverage, but through the organic spread of Joe Rogan's exposé across social media platforms and alternative media outlets that reached audiences no conventional news organization could access. Within 72 hours of his initial podcast, millions of Americans who had never paid attention to White House press briefings were sharing clips of Karoline Leavitt's most egregious propaganda performances alongside Rogan's analysis of their authoritarian implications. What Joe Rogan did was give people permission to see what they were already feeling, explained Dr. Sarah Rodriguez, a political communications specialist at Georgetown University. Most Americans could sense that something was wrong with how this administration communicated, but they didn't have the analytical framework to articulate what they were seeing. Rogan provided that framework. The impact was measurable and immediate. Viewership of White House press briefings increased by 400% as people tuned in specifically to watch Leavitt employ the propaganda techniques that Rogan had identified and explained. But instead of the intended effect of normalizing her approach, the increased scrutiny made her deception more obvious and less effective. "It's like learning how magic tricks work," observed media analyst Brian Stelter during a CNN segment about the phenomenon. Once Joe Rogan explained how Karoline Leavitt manipulates information and attacks questioners, viewers could no longer be fooled by her techniques. Every briefing became evidence of the propaganda operation rather than effective communication. But it was the response from working journalists that truly revealed how Rogan's analysis had changed the dynamic between the press corps and the White House communications operation. Joe Rogan gave us language to describe what we've been experiencing for months, explained Washington Post reporter Ashley Parker during a press conference about media-government relations. We knew that Leavitt wasn't engaging with our questions honestly, but having someone with Rogan's platform explain the systematic nature of her deception made it easier for us to push back against her propaganda in real time. The change in press briefing dynamics was immediate and dramatic. Instead of allowing Leavitt to control conversations through aggressive deflection and personal attacks, reporters began directly referencing Rogan's analysis and demanding that she address the specific propaganda techniques he had identified. "Miss Leavitt, Joe Rogan documented your pattern of attacking questioners rather than answering questions," CNN's Caitlin Collins said during a briefing that became a viral sensation. "Given that analysis, can you explain why you're attacking me right now instead of addressing the substance of my question about economic policy?" Leavitt's response provided perfect, real-time confirmation of Rogan's thesis. "I'm not going to dignify biased questions from reporters who have already decided to attack this administration regardless of what I say. The American people can see through your obvious attempts to create controversy rather than report news." "And there it is," Collins replied, turning to address the camera directly. "She just did exactly what Joe Rogan said she would do, attacked me personally, while avoiding the policy question entirely." The exchange became one of the most watched political clips of the year, demonstrating in real time how Rogan's analysis had provided both journalists and audiences with tools for recognizing and countering propaganda techniques. But the most significant impact came from congressional Republicans who found themselves forced to choose between defending Leavitt's propaganda operation or acknowledging that her techniques were damaging to their own credibility. Effectiveness. "I've served in Congress for 12 years, and I've worked with press secretaries from both parties," said Representative Mike Turner during a televised interview. "What Karoline Leavitt is doing isn't partisan politics. It's systematic deception that makes it impossible for any of us to have credible conversations with our constituents about government policy." The bipartisan nature of the criticism was particularly damaging because it came from Republicans who had previously supported Trump but were now concerned about the long-term implications of normalizing authoritarian communication tactics. When a government official's first instinct is always to lie and attack, it destroys public trust in all government institutions, explained former Republican Congressman Joe Scarborough during a segment that was widely shared across social media platforms. Joe Rogan performed a public service by exposing how systematically Karoline Leavitt has been deceiving the American people. But it was the internal pressure within the Trump administration itself that ultimately forced a reckoning with Leavitt's propaganda operation and its political costs. Senior White House staff are privately expressing concerns that Leavitt's confrontational approach is making it impossible to advance the administration's policy agenda, reported Politico in a story that was clearly based on extensive internal sources. Even officials who support aggressive communication strategies are worried that her propaganda techniques have become counterproductive. The concerns were well-founded, as polling data showed that public trust in White House communications had reached historic lows, while approval ratings for the administration's handling of media relations had dropped below 30%, even among Republican voters. The problem with propaganda is that once people recognize it as propaganda, it stops being effective and starts being counterproductive, explained Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a specialist in political communication at Harvard's Kennedy School. Joe Rogan's expose didn't just inform people about Leavitt's techniques, it immunized them against those techniques. The immunization effect was measurable and politically significant. Focus groups conducted after Rogan's expose showed that viewers were no longer persuaded by Leavitt's aggressive deflection and personal attacks, instead viewing them as evidence of deception and incompetence. Participants who had previously found her performances convincing now described them as obviously fake and insulting to their intelligence, reported the polling firm that conducted the research. Rogan's analysis had fundamentally changed how people processed her communications. As the political pressure mounted, and Leavitt's propaganda operation became increasingly recognized as a liability rather than an asset, the question facing the Trump administration was whether to modify their communication strategy or double down on authoritarian techniques regardless of their political effectiveness. The answer came in the form of escalated attacks not just on Rogan personally, but on the broader principle that government communications should be subject to independent analysis and criticism. The final confrontation between Joe Rogan's truth-telling and Karoline Leavitt's propaganda machine came when the White House made the catastrophic decision to have Leavitt appear on Rogan's podcast to set the record straight and expose the lies that have been spread about the administration's communications strategy. The decision, which appeared to be driven by Trump's personal anger at being criticized by someone with Rogan's massive platform, represented exactly the kind of authoritarian overconfidence that had characterized Leavitt's entire approach to her role. Instead of recognizing that her propaganda techniques had been exposed and adjusting accordingly, the administration doubled down on the belief that aggressive deflection and personal attacks could overcome any criticism. "I'm actually excited about this," Rogan told his audience during the podcast episode that preceded Leavitt's scheduled appearance. "She's going to come on here and do exactly what I've been describing: attack me personally, deflect from substantive questions, and present false information with complete confidence. It's going to be a real-time demonstration of everything I've been explaining about authoritarian communication tactics." The build-up to the interview generated unprecedented interest, with advanced viewership estimates suggesting that it would be one of the most watched political conversations in podcast history. But it was the strategic preparation that Rogan and his team had undertaken that would make the interview a definitive exposure of propaganda techniques rather than a platform for their dissemination. "We've prepared specific questions based on documented facts that she can't deny or deflect," Rogan explained to his producer. "When she tries to attack me instead of answering, I'm going to point out exactly what she's doing and why she's doing it. When she presents false information, I'm going to have the real facts ready to present immediately." The interview began exactly as Rogan had predicted, with Leavitt immediately going on the offensive rather than engaging with any substantive discussion of her role or performance. "Joe, I think we need to address the fact that your previous podcast about me was filled with lies and distortions that serve the interests of people who want to see this administration fail," Leavitt said before Rogan had even finished his introductory remarks. "Okay, perfect," Rogan replied, smiling directly at the camera. "You just did exactly what I said you would do. Instead of addressing any specific allegation I made, you immediately attacked me and presented yourself as a victim. Can you point to any specific factual error in what I said about your performance as press secretary?" Leavitt's response provided a masterclass in propaganda techniques. "I'm not going to dignify false allegations by engaging with them in detail. What I will say is that everything you presented was taken out of context and designed to make me and this administration look bad." "But that's not an answer," Rogan pressed. "I played audio recordings of you explicitly stating that your job is to control narratives rather than provide accurate information. Are you saying those recordings were fabricated?" "I'm saying that my words were taken out of context by people who have an agenda to destroy President Trump's success in delivering for the American people." The exchange continued for nearly 3 hours, with Leavitt providing perfect, real-time confirmation of every propaganda technique that Rogan had previously identified. She refused to engage with specific evidence, attacked Rogan's motives and credibility, deflected to pro-Trump talking points that had no relationship to the questions being asked, and presented demonstrably false information with complete confidence. But it was Rogan's systematic deconstruction of her techniques in real time that made the interview a devastating exposé of authoritarian communication, rather than an effective defense of her performance. "You're doing it again right now," Rogan observed after Leavitt had spent 5 minutes attacking him, instead of addressing a question about economic statistics. "I asked you about specific unemployment figures that you cited in a press briefing, and instead of either defending those figures or acknowledging that they were incorrect, you've spent 5 minutes attacking me personally. This is exactly what I mean when I say you use propaganda techniques instead of engaging with factual discussions." The real-time analysis was devastating, because it made Leavitt's propaganda techniques visible to viewers who might have been susceptible to them under normal circumstances. Instead of being persuaded by her deflection and attacks, audiences could see exactly how she was trying to manipulate them. But the most damaging moment came when Rogan played audio recordings of her private communications and asked her to explain the context that would make her statements acceptable. Here you are telling your staff that accuracy isn't important, that the goal is to control narratives and make questioners look biased, Rogan said, playing the recording that had been featured in his original exposé. What context makes that statement consistent with your role as a public servant providing information to the American people? Leavitt's response was a perfect demonstration of authoritarian deflection. Those recordings were illegally obtained by deep state operatives who are trying to undermine this administration, and I refuse to validate their criminal behavior by commenting on materials that may have been altered or fabricated. So you're not denying that you said those things? You're just attacking the people who recorded you saying them? I'm pointing out that anything can be made to sound bad if it's taken out of context by people who have an agenda to destroy conservative voices. By the end of the 3-hour interview, Leavitt had provided such a comprehensive demonstration of propaganda techniques that even her supporters were forced to acknowledge that Rogan's original analysis had been accurate. She had refused to engage with any factual questions, attacked Rogan constantly while presenting herself as a victim, and delivered false information with the kind of confidence that would have impressed North Korean state media. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours of the interview's release, social media platforms were flooded with clips showing Leavitt employing exactly the propaganda techniques that Rogan had warned about, while commentary from across the political spectrum acknowledged that she had confirmed every criticism that had been leveled against her communication style. Karoline Leavitt just provided the most comprehensive demonstration of authoritarian communication techniques in American political history, observed former Republican strategist Steve Schmidt during a televised analysis of the interview. Joe Rogan gave her 3 hours to defend herself and explain her approach, and she spent the entire time proving that his original criticism was completely accurate. But perhaps the most significant response came from within the Trump administration itself, where staff members who had been privately concerned about Leavitt's propaganda operation now felt validated in their concerns and emboldened to speak publicly about the damage she was causing to their political objectives. After watching that interview, I think everyone understands why our approval ratings for communication effectiveness are at historic lows, said a senior White House official who spoke on condition of anonymity. You can't build public trust by constantly attacking anyone who asks questions, and you can't advance policy objectives by refusing to engage with factual discussions. Within 72 hours of the Rogan interview, Karoline Leavitt had resigned as White House press secretary, citing personal attacks from the fake news media and their allies, but acknowledging privately to staff that her propaganda techniques had become politically unsustainable. But the broader impact of Rogan's exposé extended far beyond the fate of one press secretary. By systematically identifying and explaining authoritarian communication techniques, he had provided the American public with tools for recognizing and resisting propaganda that would serve them long after the current political moment had passed. What Joe Rogan accomplished was essentially a form of civic education, explained Dr. Maria Santos, a specialist in democratic institutions at Columbia University. He taught millions of Americans how to recognize when they're being manipulated by government officials, regardless of which party those officials represent. The lesson was particularly important because it transcended partisan politics to focus on fundamental questions about the relationship between government and citizens in a democratic society. By exposing how propaganda techniques could be used to manipulate public opinion and suppress accountability, Rogan had strengthened democratic institutions in ways that would benefit all Americans regardless of their political affiliations. Asterisk. The story concludes with Leavitt's resignation, leading to broader reforms in White House communications, the appointment of a more qualified and honest press secretary, and lasting changes in how American media and audiences evaluate government communications. Joe Rogan's exposé becomes a template for holding government officials accountable for propaganda techniques. while the American public becomes more sophisticated in recognizing and resisting authoritarian communication tactics. Asterisk,